Welcome to, or welcome back to, the Agatha May Detective Agency. I'm Agatha May, and in this video, we are going to be looking at all the times that the police have been involved with John Paul Miller. But first, I want to say thank you to Sandra and to Dr. Mama for the super thanks. I've recently received a stack of FOIA requests for all the times that John Paul Miller was somehow involved with a call to the police, and boy howdy are there a lot. We start with the incident at the ice cream parlor. On April 16, 2016, John Paul Miller's now ex-wife Allison received a message from one of her sons who was with John Paul at the time. Her son told her that he wanted her to come pick him up because he and John Paul were in an argument and he wanted to go home. Allison called the police because John Paul refused to let her talk to their son and claimed the son's phone wasn't working. She was naturally worried. The police went to the ice cream parlor and found that the son was upset because John Paul threatened to take his phone away and not let him get ice cream. The police assessed the situation and found that the boy was fine and was happily eating ice cream. What a saga, huh? It seems like John Paul could have just let Allison talk to their son, and the police wouldn't have to show up over absolutely nothing. On December 14th of 2016, John Paul made contact, which is the phrase used in the police report, with Allison at their child's bus stop. Let's stop here for a minute and go over what we know about John Paul's actions after Allison left him. He stalked her a lot. So when he made contact with Allison, I'm going to guess he was stalking her. So Allison and John Paul got into a verbal altercation at the bus stop. Later in the day, Allison's boyfriend called John Paul, and according to John Paul, was cursing and threatening him about contacting Allison. Let's keep in mind that this is John Paul's account, so who knows how accurate it is. He wasn't specific about what kind of threats were made either. Was it, contact her again and you'll swim with the fishes? Or, contact her again and I'm going to thump you really hard on your head? John Paul hung up on the boyfriend because that's just the kind of badass he is, and he blocked the boyfriend's phone number. So ferocious. Then Whiny Pants had to call the police because he wanted a record of the event. On February 23rd of 2017, John Paul called police due to a burglary, a real live burglary. Kind of. John Paul had been out of town for a few days and said that when he got home he checked his email and found that purchases were made on the 21st from redacted iPhones that were at his house. Maybe the redacted word is church? The phones were password protected, and he said that he and one other person were the only ones who knew the passwords. When John Paul went to look for the phones, one was dead and the other had been moved. He also claimed that his laptop had been gone through and all of his history had been deleted. I'm assuming he meant internet history. According to the police report, John Paul suspected that the theft was done by Redacted, who had redacted the time he was out of town but has no proof. Let's play fill in the blank. Was the theft done by Lacey, who had house sat the time he was out of town? I've heard rumors that it was Lacey, but I don't have any more proof than John Paul did. The police report also states that JP had 2 roommates at the time who were at work during the day and could have left the front door unlocked. The police attempted to contact the person John Paul suspected, but couldn't get a hold of them, and as far as they were concerned, case closed. On March 7th of 2017, John Paul Miller, the prevaricating preacher, called police to his house for harassing phone calls. You guessed it, it was Dreamy McBoyfriend again. John Paul told police that Dreamy regularly sent him threatening messages. Well, it's nice they bonded over something. The messages were telling John Paul that if he didn't pay Allison the money he owed her, Dreamy was going to give him a thrashing, or something like that. John Paul said that Dreamy had also damaged his vehicle in the past. Sure, JP, I am pretty sure that you would have called the police if anyone had damaged your vehicle. John Paul told police that Dreamy had threatened him over a 2-year period, but has never acted on the threats. But John Paul still wanted an incident report and wanted the police to call Dreamy and give him a good talking to. Dreamy admitted that he'd threatened to whoop up on John Paul, but said he was just mad and didn't have any plans on actually acting on the threats, much like he'd done for the past 2 years. The police told Dreamy, "Don't do that," and once again, case closed. On March 7th of 2017, that's not a mistake on the dates, it happened again. I guess John Paul didn't get enough attention the first time, so he called the police again. But this time he called them on his minor son. Whiny Pants Miller told police that his son was sending him life-threatening messages and said his son is very angry and has damaged his vehicle. I guess in order to send John Paul threatening messages, you have to damage his vehicle too. That's so weird. It's almost like John Paul was making up the damage to his vehicles. The police went to Allison's house where the son lived and I guess had a talk to him, then went back to John Paul's and possibly told him to settle things with his son like a grown adult parent would do. On June 12th of 2018, John Paul called the police and requested a call back because there was loud music and lots of cars just being loud. So many cars. The noise ordinance in Myrtle Beach states no loud noises after 11 p.m. John Paul called police 6 minutes after 11. I guess there are some times he wants to be a stickler for the rules. There's nothing on the report to indicate that anyone called him back. On June 18th of 2018, Allison called police because John Paul had the children on Father's Day, but was only supposed to keep them until 6 p.m. He returned the 2 boys that were visiting with him, but kept their daughter. When Allison went to pick her up, John Paul refused and stated that the daughter wanted to stay with him. The custody agreement stated that John Paul could have the children for 1 week in June, July, and August, but had to make a request in advance. He told officers that he had made a request, but was unable to provide proof. Was John Paul lying about that? I can't believe he'd ever lie. The police made him return their daughter to Allison. So for the entire summer, John Paul only had his children for 1 week each month. On June 24th, 2018, there was another argument over who was keeping the kids. John Paul expected to have them for a week because Allison had given him permission, but she said that was before the police were called the week prior. She ended up caving and letting John Paul have them for the week, and then asked the officers to tell John Paul to never contact her for any reason other than picking up or dropping off the kids, or in case of an emergency. On September 21st of 2018, John Paul called the police because his 91-year-old neighbor was standing in his yard yelling and screaming and thought his house was a thrift store. When police got there, the story changed and his garage was a flea market. He said he didn't think she meant anything, but she was disturbing the household and the neighbors. Personally, I think John Paul was scared of his 91-year-old neighbor. The neighbor's son showed up and all was right with the world, and John Paul's garage remained unshopped. Phew, that was a close call. On September 25th of 2018, just 4 days after calling the police on his 91-year-old neighbor, John Paul was calling the police again. This time, he was supposed to have his children from 4:30 to 8 p.m. He was upset because one of his sons couldn't be there at the designated time because he was at a birthday party. John Paul told police that he needed a report for a mediation hearing. The police told him that no custodial interference took place, but John Paul insisted on getting a report. I'll bet the officers love that. On December 2nd, 2018, John Paul and Micah were married by now, and John Paul called the police because his now adult son was supposed to have done a job at the church, but instead went out of town. The son had just returned, and John Paul was asking him to give the keys to the vehicle back, but I wonder if it was more like demanding. The son refused and started breaking things in the house. John Paul and Micah were hiding in the bedroom when police arrived. There's nothing on the report about the outcome, and I couldn't find an arrest for the son on that day. Susan Miller, John Paul's mother, alleged in an affidavit filed in her divorce to Wayne that he and John Paul would get into fights and would end up with the police being called. John Paul has done nothing to break the cycle and end the generational trauma. There wasn't another call made to police until 2022, which I think is remarkable. For all of John Paul's talk about Micah's mental illness and how he claims she tried to commit suicide 6 or 7 times and had psychotic breaks, things were quiet at their house for almost 4 years. I think that speaks a lot to Micah's ability to keep the peace, especially between John Paul and Allison. On November 17th of 2022, Micah went out of town to visit her sister. John Paul was not happy about it. He started texting the sister saying he was on his way to her house. Even after being told not to come, his response was, "I'm armed, I'm ready." He and Micah began texting, and he told her that if she wasn't home by 9 a.m., all of her stuff in the house would go to Goodwill. He then told her she was a horrible wife, and when he got there, he was going to raise hell. Micah called the Myrtle Beach police to go check and see if John Paul was actually at home, and was worried he was suicidal. She also said that he'd just purchased multiple guns. When the police arrived at his house, John Paul was taking out the trash, so if he was armed, it was with a hefty bag. Police determined that he was not having suicidal thoughts. This is what abuse and coercive control look like. This is what Micah had to live with. Manipulation, lies, threats, fear. On December 5th of 2022, one of Micah's sisters called police requesting a wellness check on Micah. She said that Micah had just been released from the hospital into John Paul's custody and that he mentally abused her. There is no follow-up on the report. On October 14th of 2023, Micah called about an unnamed civil matter, and police referred her to civil court or divorce court. On December 12th of 2023, police were called to John Paul's house by his brother-in-law, Lacey's husband. He said that John Paul had his baby in the house and wouldn't give the baby back to him. John Paul said he wanted the baby to stay the night. Officers determined that the baby was staying at the residence with Lacey and told the father to work things out in family court. On February 7th, 2024, Micah called police and told them that she had fled to her sister's house in Florence, South Carolina. She stated that John Paul's family members were staying at the house, but she didn't want them there. She also stated they have a laptop with naked pictures on it. She requested that police go by the house and get the laptop and perform a welfare check on the house and write down the license plate numbers of the vehicles at the house. The report states that dispatch would have an officer call her. The report also states that Micah is 1096, which is 10 code for mentally ill, and has a pickup order, which is usually for a mental health issue, a juvenile issue, and sometimes is used for a misdemeanor in lieu of a warrant. The day after this call, Micah was involuntarily committed to the hospital and was released 48 hours later. Her call to police sounds like she was having some kind of episode, but if she was released on an involuntary commitment after 48 hours, they didn't find anything to hold her for. So it doesn't sound like it was a psychotic break to me. Was this one of those times she was given illegal drugs like she alluded to in one of her videos? On February 9th of 2024, Micah called the police while she was in the hospital because John Paul had come to the hospital and gotten her things. She said that he was using her phone to text people and pretending it was her. She was requesting that an officer go to their house and get her belongings and hold them until she got out. The nurses wouldn't let the officer back to Micah's room unless he took off his weapon, so he had the nurses relay a message to Micah that it was a civil matter. On February 15th of 2024, Micah called police to say that she thinks John Paul is in a manic state and that he has beaten her, abused her, and choked her in the past. She told the officers that he stole all of her belongings and has been impersonating her on her phone. The dispatch log shows that Micah had called several times that day, but there aren't any other incident reports. The incident states again that Micah is 1096, and it's once again a civil issue. On February 24th of 2024, John Paul called police saying that Micah and her father were at his house and were beating on the doors and windows yelling, "Let me in, let me in." I'm surprised he didn't add, "Or I'll huff and I'll puff and I'll blow your house in." John Paul continued the call by telling dispatch that he was in the back room with his sister and 2 dogs, and that Micah and Michael wouldn't let him out of his house. He also said that one of them had blocked the doorbell camera and they were beating on the door. John Paul said that Micah had just gotten out of the hospital and wasn't taking her meds. He also said that the police department will know she's mentally ill and that he has nothing of hers in the house. Micah then called the police and told them that John Paul had taken her vehicle and he'd called her to come pick it up. When the police got on the scene, John Paul told them that Micah had ran away from the sheriff in early February and that she'd been in the hospital for 10 days and hadn't taken her medication for 5 days. Michael was trespassed off the property indefinitely. John Paul told the responding officers that he just wanted Micah to get help. The officers advised both John Paul and Micah that the property dispute was a civil one. First off, John Paul lied about how long she'd been in the hospital, and how would he know if she was taking her meds or not? On March 11th of 2024, Micah called police to report that a tire deflation device had been put on her tire. She also said she noticed strange activity and she believed that there were people watching and following her. Police determined that there wasn't sufficient evidence to prove who had put the device in her tire. Micah made no more calls to Myrtle Beach Police Department. It infuriates me that on some of these police reports, they indicate that she was 1096, even if she wasn't presenting as such. And it was as though that made it easy for them to just write her off and not really pay attention to what she was saying. This is the narrative that John Paul pushed. She was mentally ill and off her meds, and he was fine. I don't think John Paul Miller was or is fine. I think there needs to be some type of entity that can deal with civil calls that come through the police. There need to be mediators who are trained in civil disputes who can actually help people who are reaching out. And that is the end of the heavy portion of the video. Now we return to our regularly scheduled programming of humor and snark. On May 1st, 2024, one of John Paul's neighbors called to report that there were a bunch of young Asian females inside the residence. He also stated that there were sheets on the windows, and he thought it was possible that there was sex trafficking happening. Lacey was at the house and allowed the officers to look inside, and they didn't see anything suspicious. She told them she believed it could have been her husband calling to make complaints on her because they were going through a divorce. Sure, Lacey. So this is the caller who stated that John Paul almost ran him down the morning of the Saturday that Micah died. Is this caller completely honest and accurate? Did he have a beef with John Paul and exaggerate just a bit? Is he just a grumpy old man and wants everybody to get off his lawn? I would hope that the police or FBI or whoever is asking him questions and double-checking to see if John Paul had stayed in Charleston that night like he said. What if John Paul's grumpy neighbor, who John Paul probably doesn't even think twice about, is the one who ends up having the information to upset his alibi? On May 7th of 2024, John Paul called police to report that he was driving and was being followed and was pretty sure the person following him had pointed a gun out the window. Uh-oh, stranger danger. When police showed up and got both men pulled over, John Paul said that the man had driven by his house and made gestures to him. John Paul got scared and left. Well, gestures can be super scary, especially if you're a little weenie like John Paul. I'll bet he can't hang around any Italian people because all their expressive gestures would have him positively peeing himself. Why didn't you just go back in your house if you were so scared, bonehead? The gesticulating gentleman allowed police to search his vehicle, and there was no gun, of course. Police also found no evidence that John Paul was being threatened. On June 18th of 2024, John Paul called police and whined that people were following him and taking photos. When the officer arrived, John Paul whined again that he was being followed all over town and people were taking photos and then posting them all over social media. He said that having photos of him and of his house on social media made him feel unsafe. Well, how does it feel to be followed everywhere you go, John Paul? He showed the officers the photos, and the officer told him they all appeared to have been taken in public places, which isn't illegal. John Paul then told the officer that he doesn't know who's taking the photos, but that they are all posted by Robbie Harvey. The officer actually called Robbie Harvey, who explained that he was an independent journalist, and he never posted photos that appeared to be taken in an illegal manner. The report concluded with the officer saying that no actions are believed to be criminal. On June 19, 2024, John Paul called police to report that he'd found a GPS tracker on his truck. He said he was just randomly checking his truck and found a tracker mounted on the frame underneath his vehicle. It was taped to a magnet. John Paul then told the officer that he hadn't seen anyone in his driveway and that he had not been followed in a few days. You just called the day before complaining about everyone following you all over town, you twit. The police officer took the tracker to see if the police department could get any information off of it. Personally, I don't believe anyone put it on there other than John Paul himself. Maybe he needed to track himself so he could find his way back home. On June 21, 2024, John Paul called police to report that he'd found a camera across the street in the bushes and it was pointing right at his house. Well, John Paul sure is good about finding things in odd places, isn't he? Why was he digging around in the bushes? John Paul told the officer that he'd already taken the camera into his house before the officer arrived. Well, how convenient. He also said he had a list of people who had been harassing him. I don't believe any of this. Well, he probably does have a list of people because he seems the type. On June 29th of 2024, John Paul called police because he found another camera in the bushes and identified a female suspect who he observed through his doorbell camera. Is that bush sprouting cameras? The officer wrote in the report that he recognized John Paul from a previous encounter. Well, by now, I would think the entire police force would recognize him. John Paul showed the officer a video that the suspect uploaded, admitting they got caught outside of his house. He also said the woman was following him around town, taking pictures and posting them online with false accusations. John Paul whines some more about how he felt his life was threatened because of the woman's actions. Could he be any more of a wimp? He has the fortitude of a piece of cooked spaghetti that's been soaking in the bottom of a sink full of dirty dishwater. John Paul further complains that this same super scary woman made a fake website that contained defamatory content and false claims about him being a cult leader and being involved in criminal activities. I think John Paul just let it slip that he does not like to be called a cult leader. Police found that the website was linked from the scary woman's TikTok account, which only proves that she shared a link to it. John Paul, who is definitely not a cult leader, gave police her name and address and said that his attorney had sent her a cease and desist letter. Unlike the attorney's letter, desist was actually spelled correctly on the police report, though. The bush camera was submitted into evidence and the report was concluded. So I missed out on who the scary woman was. Does anyone know? Was it Kyler, not Tyler? Steph's case files? I'd like to know so I can properly thank her for the entertainment. That is the last of the police reports I received, but I wouldn't be surprised if John Paul has called them more than once since. You know what police report I didn't receive? The one where John Paul claimed that Micah was shooting up the neighborhood. It's almost like it didn't happen anywhere other than John Paul's brain. I have never known anyone to have the police at their house or have the police called about them as much as John Paul Miller. There have been 26 calls made since 2016. That's a little over 3 calls a year, and if we take out the almost 4 years they weren't called, that's 6.5 calls per year. Is he trying to set some kind of weird record? Is this how he thinks you make friends? You know who the common denominator is in all of these calls? It's John Paul, I'm definitely not a cult leader Miller. He wants to blame everyone else for his problems, but he is his own biggest problem. Do you know how many people have been arrested from his calls to police? 0. Which, coincidentally, is the same number of John Paul's personality score. I have been working on something big, and I mean big. So you probably won't see much of me for the next few days because I'll have my head buried in my laptop. If you are in the Agatha May Facebook group, please try to keep the riffraff out for me. And if you're not in the Agatha May Facebook group and you aren't riffraff, we'd love to have you over there. As soon as I can, I will be releasing a series of videos. Thank you so much for watching. Please subscribe, comment, and like as this helps my channel grow. Until next time, stay safe and be happy.